Welcome back to Learn SKN, and today we're going to be looking at the economics syllabus. We are going to be covering objective number 9 from section 6. We are going to be looking at economic growth versus economic development, definitions, differences, etc. But before we do that, you know what to do. Like the channel, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell to know when we'll drop a next video, and of course check out learnskn.com for some POB content. All right, so let's just jump right into the content for today. So we're looking now at the difference between, this is objective 9, the difference between economic growth and economic development. What are the differences that exist between these two terminologies? So economic growth, what is it? Now economic growth is all about focusing really on GDP, right? It uses GDP to measure the growth, economic growth, right? So economic growth is an increase in real GDP, right? An increase in real per capita GDP, gross domestic product GDP. Real GDP is the real per capita GDP is real GDP per head of population. This is found by dividing GDP by total population. So let's break down this. So economic growth, normally in economics we just say economic growth is once GDP changes, right? Once there's an increase in GDP, you have positive economic growth. If there's a decrease in GDP, you have negative economic growth. I know it sounds kind of, like a little contradictory, but if GDP goes down, it is growth, yes, but it's negative growth. So that's how the economists would explain it. It's a negative growth. So we would say the economy grew by negative 2%. They consider it growth still, example right here in the book, but it's growth nonetheless. So economic growth is a change in GDP. So if GDP goes up, that's positive economic growth. GDP goes down, then that's negative economic growth. But the part here where they're saying real per capita GDP, when you hear somebody say per capita, that is referring to dividing something by the total population. So once you hear per capita, like per capita income, that's all of the GDP divided by all of the national income divided by the population, and you have per capita income per capita. So based on the country, they might say your income per capita is high or low, right? So that's what economic growth really is. An increase in real per capita gross domestic product or GDP. Full stop. Right? It is an increase in real GDP. Or it could be a decrease, but like I said, negative. Because sometimes the nominal would tell you the economy grew, but the real would tell you a whole different story, right? So economic growth is simply an increase in real per capita domestic GDP. So it's an increase in GDP in a sense. That's positive economic growth. So an increase in real GDP, that's economic growth. It could be positive, it could be negative, but it's growth nonetheless. If there's an economic growth, there is an increase in real per capita income. Real per capita GDP. Output in the country is not only increasing, but doing so at a faster rate than any increase in population. So the formula for economic growth is change in real per capita GDP from year 1 to year 2 over real per capita GDP in year 1. So you realize that times 100. You realize that sound kind of similar to when we're looking at elasticity and those kind of things, right? So this is economic growth in year 2. They're using year 2 to measure it, and that's what it is. Change in real per capita GDP per year, from year 1 to year 2 over real per capita GDP in year 1. So if we follow down, we're going to get the table to explain further. So all I need to know for now is that economic growth is a change in real GDP. Positive economic growth is an increase in real GDP. Negative growth is a decrease in GDP, real GDP. So growth is all about a change in GDP. That's economic growth. So a change in the monetary value of goods produced within a country over a year. That's economic growth. So before we jump into the example, let's figure out what is economic development then. Right? If that's economic growth, then what is economic development? Economic development is the sustainable increase in the quality of life. The quality of life of residents in developing countries due to changing structure of the economy. That's economic development. It's all about that quality of life. So if all of a sudden we have more access to education, more access to health, more access to clean water, that is development. That is economic development. And so economic development is a sustained increase in the quality of life of residents in developing countries due to the changing structure of the economy. So whatever happened in the economy, that led to an increase in the quality of life. And so that is economic development. And so you can see the difference between economic growth and economic development. Growth is simply talking about the monetary value, the output, the value of the output of a country. That's what they're talking about, the output of a country. Saying it's got a GDP of, let's say, 1.2 billion this year. That's growth. But economic development now would be an increase, and here what it says, sustained. So it can't just be quick and one time and done. No, we're talking about going forward. This is the new way of living, the new way of life, the increased standard of living. Free school, free education, free health, more improved health, more improved education, new pipe for clean water, that kind of thing. People affording better houses, poverty lessen, people out from under the poverty line. You can afford to buy your food now. So it has to be sustained for it to be development. Right? So that's economic development. So if we're looking at the table here, right? Economic growth for economy, woodland. So this economy is called woodland. In 2000, the real per capita GDP was 9,600. In 2001, the real per capita GDP is 10,500. So if you compare 2000 to 2001, then you have a 9% economic growth. You can see it right there. 10,000 minus 9, we get the 900, so that's 9%. So we have a 9% change, right? So you can see it there. 2002, the GDP went down to 10,100. If you're comparing that to 2001, then we had a drop off because GDP declined. So you had a negative economic growth of 3.8%. So this is what GDP right here, or GDP per capita, which is GDP divided by the population. That's the answer you get, right? That's the answer you get. And so you can see growth happening in the economy because GDP would have increased. So that's economic growth. Let's look at the illustration here. Remember, again, going back to our production possibility frontier. Remember we said that if you're producing inside, you're inefficient. Along the lines, you're efficient. But outside is impossible. Now, how can you get from this one to the one outside? The only way to do that is if the economy grows. And so economic growth can lead to an increase in production. It can be caused by an increase in production. And you can see it reflected in the production possibility curve right there. That these are some aspects of economic development, right? So these can show you whether your economy is developing or not. So again, an increase in real GDP per capita, like I said, that can indicate development if it's invested properly. diversification of the economy, meaning you don't rely on one sector anymore. Back in the day, most Caribbean countries relied heavily on agriculture, heavily. And so we diversify now. We're into financial services, educational services, tourism, all those service-based industries, construction, light manufacturing, all those kind of services. We increase access to health services, more hospital beds available, additional wards being erected, health centers being erected, that kind of thing. Increase access to education. So we're talking about free education from preschool all the way up to high school and sixth form. You have school meals you can get, all those things. Infrastructure development, new road projects, new bridges being built, lights being installed, buildings being repaired, all those things. Low levels of negative externalities, for sure. In St. Kitts, in the Caribbean, we don't have much in the way of, majority of us don't have much in the way of pollution and those kind of things, right? But as development occurs, sometimes that's a byproduct of development. Because you look at China, as China develop, they actually put in more smog out in the world, more smoke as the engine of the industry is churning. As more people get money to buy cars, what's going to happen to the atmosphere with the emissions, right? So that could be a byproduct of development. Negative one, but a byproduct nonetheless. And freedom and justice. So those are some aspects of development. Now, how do they measure development? Right? One of the biggest ways, one of the more popular ways of measuring development is what we call the HDI, the Human Development Index. I'm pretty sure some of y'all would have heard about this before. Human Development Index. That's one way you can rank countries in terms of their level of development. That's a United Nations index that they use to measure a country's achievement under certain pointers like literacy rate, life expectancy, level of freedom, your welfare, those kind of things, the quality of life, right? That's what Human Development Index tries to measure, the quality of life. So if you're high on that index, then your country is all the more developed for it, because of it, right? So the HDMI is one way to measure development. Then we have the HPI, or the Human Poverty Index, and that measures deprivation using, things like, what are you lacking? Do you have access to certain health facilities? What is your debt rate? What life expectancy? Those kind of things, right? So that's the HPI and that's the HDI. So look, these are some numbers for the Caribbean, but that's a long time ago. So we'll try and look for a more modern one. Let's take a quick look, just as by the way information. Okay, good. So we have the HDI right here, right? Human Development Index, and almost every year a Scandinavian country comes out on top. Almost every year, right? So almost every year you have the Scandinavians just coming out on top, right? We have Norway, Ireland, Switzerland, Hong Kong, Iceland, Germany, Sweden. Look at that. Most of the Scandinavian countries are top 10. Netherlands, Denmark, Finland, Singapore, the UK. And you can see the annual growth of these economies as it relates to the HDI. And so once you reach in these kind of numbers, 90, 80, that's high level, right? That's a high level of development for these countries. And then we come down, we'll find St. Kitts not too far down, right? We are not too bad. In the Caribbean, we have Barbados here at 0.814. And then we should see St. Kitts right about here, 0.779, right? And we increase, over the year. So we are ranked here, 74, right? Out of course, 100 and something, so it ain't too bad still, right? 189 ain't too bad. But when you look at the Caribbean, we will be one of the top, right? So you have Bahamas, Barbados, Trinidad. And then we have Grenada, and then we have St. Kitts. We are above Ukraine, we are above Peru, Thailand, Armenia, Colombia, Brazil, China, right? Ecuador, St. Lucia, Azerbaijan, right? Moldova, Algeria. So we are above a lot of these larger countries as it relates to our Human Development Index. And of course, we have Jamaica here at 0.734. Right? So in the Caribbean, we are relatively high in the Caribbean. But we have Guyana down there still. And so remember, the HDMI factors in a lot of different things like life expectancy, your literacy rate, gender. Well, no, gender is a whole different one. But those kind of things are factored into the HDMI. Sorry, the HDI. Right? So that is one way to measure overall development for countries. Right? And like I said, for years, these countries just dominating the top. Norway, Germany, Iceland, persons of Germanic, Icelandic, or Scandinavian origin, right? The USA, imagine the USA is not even number one, right? You would think America might be a number one developed country, but it's not number one, right? Because America have a lot of poverty. Persons in rural America don't have access to certain things that we might have, clean water, proper internet, all that kind of stuff. So all that goes into the HDMI. I keep saying HDMI is in the computer card, but HDI. Right? HDI. Okay, so let's take a look at GDP though. GDP rankings. Right? And you'll see a whole different story. You see the big vast countries. Right? This is nominal GDP they're using to measure nominal GDP. And of course, America is number one. That's the largest economy in the world. America by GDP. Right? Followed by China. And so we're looking at 22 trillion. Alright, that's with a T. $22 trillion here. So imagine America produces goods and services valued at over $20 trillion in a year. I can't even wrap my mind around billion, much less trillion, right? China, same thing, 16 trillion. Japan, 5, and we work our way down. So if we look for St. Kitts, we're a small place, so, our output ain't gonna be that high, right? So we're gonna be somewhere down. Let's see if I can find us here. Okay, so we're just 198, right? Small country, right? That's about, what's that? 800 million. That's not too bad. 800 million US in a year. We can do something with that, right? So not too bad, but we're a small nation, and so we can't really produce on that level. Most of us in the Caribbean cannot produce on that kind of level. We just do not have the scale to produce $22 trillion worth of goods, right? So St. Lucia is up there, right? Larger than us for sure, but I guess they're doing more in services, which is a big earner. Little manufacturing, so Antigua is up there also. So we have some ways to go as it relates to our GDP, and we have some ways to go, right? Different countries give different ranking, different entities, IMF, the UN, and World Bank, all of them give their own version of calculating GDP. So the numbers might be a little different, right? And all these are from 2020, numbers from 2020. And so you can see where we rank in terms of GDP. Right? So I hope that this cements what we are talking about. So with all of that, right? With all of that, let's look at the conclusion here in the book. Economic growth is therefore simply the increase in real per capita GDP. Economic growth is but one aspect of development. A country can experience growth but no development, as I asked earlier, For economic development to take place in a country, there must be a reduction in poverty. Food, shelter, healthcare must reach all citizens. There must be social and economic equality. Unemployment must be reduced. The United Nations HD Human Development Report should show exactly how we're improving. Right? Countries remain poor and underdevelopment for a variety of reasons. Some of these include insufficient natural resources, lack of human capital, attitude and culture of the people, the behavior of elite groups in the economy, everybody keeping all the money for themselves, high birth rates and population growth rates, a break in the rule of law, and so these are some sources of underdevelopment. So with that long dive into growth and development, do we understand any better economic growth versus economic development? Do we understand it any better? Alright, so we'll study it for now, and that's just our look at the difference between economic growth and economic development. So what you can do now is look at the other videos from this section, section 6. Remember, we have a whole playlist with econ lectures, so look at those. You can also jump on to learn SKN, those who are into POB, who are doing POB, to get some POB content there. Alright, so thanks for watching, thanks for listening, like, subscribe, hit the bell.